December 28, 1943. Willow Run, Michigan. The photograph you're looking at was taken inside the largest factory on Earth, but take a closer look. Why are rows of German prisoners of war marching straight through an American assembly line? Who allowed them inside a place so secret that even U.S. workers needed clearance to enter? And why do the men around them, American welders, mechanics, riveters, barely look up, as if this impossible scene were somehow normal? Who was the photographer who captured this moment? Was he documenting a routine tour, or recording something no one was supposed to see? And the strangest question of all, where were these POWs being taken? Right into the heart of the arsenal of democracy. And what did they witness here that would later change their lives forever? This is the story behind the photograph, a day when America let its enemy walk straight into its greatest secret and left them speechless. February 12, 1944, Willow Run, Michigan. The air vibrated before they even stepped inside, an endless metallic hum rising from the earth like the heartbeat of a giant. Frost clung to the windows of the military bus as it rolled to a stop, brakes hissing in the cold morning air. When the doors opened, 50 German prisoners of war filed out, their boots crunching on the frozen gravel. They blinked against the clouded breath drifting around them, eyes fixed on the massive walls of the Ford Willow Run plant stretching farther than any building they had ever seen. The guards did not march them harshly. They simply gestured toward the entrance. Even that small detail unsettled the prisoners. Most of these men had been captured in North Africa or Sicily, shipped across the Atlantic in rust-smelling Liberty ships, then sent to quiet American camps where the rules seemed impossibly relaxed. But this, being escorted into the world's largest factory, felt different, wrong, like stepping behind the curtain of a magician's trick. One POW whispered under his breath, "Why would they bring us here?" No one answered. Not even the guards knew the full reason. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with oil and electricity. Rows of fluorescent lights glowed overhead like a second sky. And then came the moment, the shock that froze all movement, all breath, all certainty. The prisoners looked down the main assembly corridor and saw America in motion. Men and women, Americans of every face and color, moved together in a rhythm so precise it felt choreographed. A black welder in heavy gloves sealed a seam in a wing panel. 2 white farm boys, barely old enough to shave, hoisted a landing gear assembly into place. A middle-aged woman in a faded bandana tightened bolts with a pneumatic gun, her arms steady, her jaw set with determination. A man with an Eastern European accent called measurements over the roar, his voice cutting through the clatter as naturally as breathing. There was no chaos, no shouting, no fear, just purpose. And then they saw it, a massive silver fuselage gliding down the line like a steel whale, a B-24 Liberator, its skin gleaming under the factory lights. It moved forward inch by inch as hundreds of hands worked on it, each station adding something new: cables, rivets, fuel lines, oxygen systems. A guard muttered, almost proudly, "One rolls out of here every 63 minutes." The German prisoners stared, stunned silent. They had heard rumors. American prisoners captured in Tunisia had whispered about endless factories and infinite planes. But German propaganda back home had insisted it was impossible. America was supposed to be lazy, distracted, a land of weak-willed consumers who could never match German discipline or engineering. They had been taught that democracies were too soft, too divided, too spoiled to fight a long war. Yet here they stood, watching the United States produce bombers faster than Germany could produce bread. One prisoner, a former engineering student from Hamburg, clutched the railing beside him. His voice trembled. "This can't be real." But it was. A giant clock mounted on the wall measured the progress of each hour. When the minute hand struck the top of the dial, a new B-24, fully assembled, polished, tested, rolled toward the hangar doors at the far end of the plant. Workers cheered as it passed, wiping sweat from their brows, joking with one another, sometimes breaking into short bursts of song as they grabbed their lunch pails or moved to the next task. It wasn't only the machines that overwhelmed the POWs, it was the people. They had expected grim soldiers. Instead, they saw girls in their teens tightening rivets with practiced precision, Rosie the Riveter types with smudged cheeks and proud eyes. They saw men of every background, Southern accents, Detroit slang, foreign-born speech, working side by side with no sign of the racial or class divisions Nazi propaganda had insisted were tearing America apart. One prisoner watched a black mechanic teaching a white newcomer how to adjust a hydraulic line. The mechanic spoke with easy confidence. The younger worker nodded respectfully, absorbing every word. The German blinked, confused. In his world, such cooperation was unthinkable. "Do you see this?" he whispered to the man beside him. His companion only stared, jaw slack. Farther down the line, an elderly worker in a wool cap paused to take a sip from a tin thermos. When he noticed the group of prisoners watching, he raised his cup slightly, an informal nod, neither hostile nor afraid. The gesture hit harder than any threat. The Germans had expected contempt, maybe hatred. They found indifference, a kind of peaceful assurance. These workers were too busy building the arsenal that would end the war to waste energy hating anyone. The group moved deeper into the plant, each step peeling back another layer of disbelief. They passed a team aligning bomb, racks, then another soldering radio equipment. Everywhere they looked, people performed tasks so specialized and synchronized that each operation seemed as important as the last. One POW murmured, "We thought we understood the enemy." Another answered softly, "No, we never did." When they reached the far end of the floor, sunlight streamed in through tall industrial windows. There, resting on its massive wheels, was a finished B-24 Liberator, engines gleaming, wings stretching wider than a church. A line of workers stood around it, making final checks, patting the fuselage as if wishing it luck. The Germans could smell the fuel. They could see the pilot climb the stairs. They could hear the distant rumble as the engines turned over, coughing once, twice, and then roaring to life. The entire group stopped walking. Some gasped. Others simply stared, their faces drained of color. They had been soldiers once, proud, confident, certain of their nation's strength. But here, in the beating heart of America's industrial miracle, they felt something new. The quiet, creeping realization that they had underestimated the United States in every possible way. In that moment, a question formed silently in every mind. If America can build this much, this fast, with this many people working together, how can anyone hope to defeat it? No one spoke. They didn't have to. The roar of the B-24 rising toward the sky carried the answer. And as the bomber lifted off the runway, disappearing into the winter haze, the 50 German POWs remained frozen in place. Overwhelmed, humbled, and shaken by the country they had been told would never withstand the might of the Reich. For the first time since their capture, they were truly, utterly silent. They had been told many things before they ever set foot on American soil. Warnings whispered in barracks, repeated in training fields, etched into their minds by speeches, posters, and radio broadcasts that spoke with the certainty of gospel truth. America, they were taught, was a land of industrial savages. Factories run by undisciplined mobs, workers who drank, brawled, and slept on the job. A society too chaotic, too soft, too morally rotten to withstand a long war. A place where prisoners of war would vanish into labor camps and never return. And now, as the Germans moved deeper into Willow Run's vast interior, every step seemed to tear another page out of that familiar script. One of the younger POWs, a 20-year-old foot soldier from Cologne, felt his stomach twist. He remembered a pamphlet handed out during basic training, its crude drawings showing American factories in ruins, workers rioting, black and white Americans fighting each other while Jewish businessmen counted the profits. "This is what democracy leads to," the sergeant had said. "Chaos, frailty, decadence." But here, in this American factory, there was no chaos, no brawling, no idleness. Only motion, precision, and a sense of purpose so strong it felt almost religious. Fear crept beneath the prisoner's skin, not the fear of guns or guards, but the fear that everything they had believed about the world might have been wrong. They had expected to see brutality. Instead, they saw efficiency. They had expected to see moral decay. Instead, they saw determination written into every movement of the American workers. The noise alone was overwhelming. Automized cranes rattled overhead, conveyor tracks clattered and hummed, rivet guns snapped in rapid bursts like distant gunfire, each pop marking another point of progress on a liberator wing. The Germans had heard stories of mechanized American industry, but none of them imagined anything on this scale. A machine so large that it swallowed people like insects and produced bombers like clockwork toys. A former corporal, once proud of his mechanical training in Munich, struggled to process the sight before him. "It's too clean," he muttered to himself. "Too organized." His friend whispered, "How do they keep this many people working together without military discipline?" No one answered, because the question itself unsettled them. Then came the second shock. A woman, barely 5 feet tall, hair tucked under a polka-dot bandana, maneuvered a heavy drill along a fuselage section with the ease of a veteran machinist. The drill hissed and spun, sparks fluttering like fireflies. She didn't hesitate once. Her hands were steady, her posture confident. She even hummed softly to herself over the roar of machinery. Back in Germany, women had been pulled reluctantly into labor as a last resort, and propaganda constantly portrayed American women as frivolous, weak, or morally corrupted. Seeing them here, essential, capable, respected, clashed violently with everything the POWs had been conditioned to believe. A gray-haired sergeant from Bremen stared openly. "Frauen," he whispered. "They let women do this?" He wasn't mocking. He wasn't scoffing. He was afraid. Near the lunch station, several workers in grease-stained overalls sat on overturned crates, tearing into sandwiches and hamburgers the size of a man's fist. They laughed, joked, and wiped their hands on napkins before returning to the line. No shortages, no ration panic, no hollow-cheeked faces like those back home, no one hiding hunger. One POW sniffed the air, the smell of cooked beef drifting from a break room, and felt an ache of humiliation in his stomach. His last meal in Germany had been turnip soup. Here, even workers in the lowest ranks ate better than many German officers. Everywhere the Germans looked, something contradicted their expectations. Posters declaring, "The greatest generation can build anything. Work hard, win faster. Freedom builds strength." Statistics chalked on boards. 196,000 planes this year. Every hour counts. And, most jarring of all, welcome women workers. 8 million. Strong. The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. 8 million? How could a nation spare 8 million women and still function? How could a country that supposedly lacked discipline produce aircraft at a rate the Reich couldn't even approach? A middle-aged POW, once a university student in Berlin, recalled a speech by Goebbels comparing American industry to a bloated, clumsy giant. He felt heat rise in his face. The giant standing before him now was neither clumsy nor bloated. It was awake, disciplined, and stronger than anything Germany could have imagined. The further they went, the more the fear thickened. The guards didn't impose order. They didn't shout commands. They simply walked, letting the Germans observe. That calmness alone was unnerving. In Germany, this many people moving in coordinated labor required barking foremen, rigid ranks, and threats of punishment. Here, people worked fast because they wanted to. A black welder sparked a seam closed, sparks flying like gold dust. A white electrician leaned in to help him adjust a cable clamp. They spoke with the ease of longtime colleagues, their voices warm, familiar. The Germans watched the interaction in silence. They had been told America was torn apart by race, that its cities burned with hatred, that democracy bred disorder. Yet here were two men working together, smiling, finishing each other's sentences, their partnership so natural it shook the prisoners to their core. Then, in the middle of the tour, one worker stepped away from a wing frame, took a bite of his hamburger, and noticed the POW group watching. Instead of glaring or spitting or mocking, he simply nodded, as if greeting a neighbor on the street. The gesture made several Germans step back instinctively. How could the enemy be this unafraid? That question lingered in the air long after they moved on. The prisoners felt the weight of history pressing against them. In 1944, the United States had an economy larger than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. Detroit, once known for cars, had become the beating heart of the arsenal of democracy, producing tanks, jeeps, aircraft engines, and bombers faster than entire nations could react. American factories ran day and night, untouched by bombs, fueled by abundant resources and staffed by workers who believed in victory as fervently as soldiers on the front lines. The Germans walking through Willow Run realized, perhaps for the first time, that they had not been fighting a country. They had been fighting a world power unlike any other, a power unharmed by war, united in purpose, capable of producing machines of destruction with the reliability of a metronome. The propaganda they had swallowed for years began to crumble under the sheer weight of reality. Fear took root, not fear of punishment or brutality, but fear of truth, fear of a nation that could outthink, outbuild, and outlast them at every turn. As the group reached the midpoint of the tour, the engines of a test-running Liberator thundered through the building, rattling metal sheets and vibrating the concrete floor. The Germans instinctively flinched. Workers didn't. They hardly looked up. The fear was no longer simple apprehension. It was the dawning realization that the war they once believed Germany could win was being fought against a country that didn't just build weapons. It built miracles. Willow Run was not merely a factory. It was a revelation, and every revelation tightened the quiet, icy knot forming in each prisoner's chest. Because if America could do all this while sending millions of men overseas, if it could mobilize 8 million women and still feed its people well, if it could make bombers faster than Germany could repair them, then perhaps the outcome of the war had already been decided, long before a single POW ever set foot in Michigan. The tour should have ended in fear. Everything the German prisoners had seen, America's strength, its speed, its unity, should have left them withdrawn, defensive, bracing for the cruelty they had been promised. That is what propaganda had prepared them for. That was the shape of the enemy they expected. But Willow Run had one more surprise waiting for them. One no German officer, no party official, no radio broadcast had ever warned them about. It began as they stepped off the factory floor and into a quieter corridor lined with tool rooms and supply closets. The roar of machinery faded to a distant thunder. A man in a clean-buttoned shirt and thick-framed glasses approached, carrying a clipboard. He looked about 50, with gray at his temples and the steady, calm presence of someone who had spent decades solving problems under pressure. He studied the POW group with an expression that was neither hostile nor suspicious, just curious. "Morning, fellas," he said casually, as if greeting neighbors arriving for a barn raising. "I'm Harold Thompson, line supervisor." The Germans stiffened. A few instinctively snapped their hands to their sides, unsure if they were supposed to salute. Instead, Thompson did something unimaginable. He extended his hand. The first prisoner in line, a thin, tired man named Weber, hesitated. His eyes flicked to the guards, then back to the supervisor. Slowly, awkwardly, he accepted the handshake. Thompson's grip was firm but warm, the grip of a man who had spent his life in factories, not battlefields. "War is terrible," Thompson said in a voice too gentle for such a loud place. "But work is work. Welcome to Willow Run." The words hit the prisoners harder than the roar of any B-24 engine. A few blinked rapidly, unsure how to respond. One swallowed hard, trying to hide the sudden heat behind his eyes. Kindness was not what they expected. Kindness was disarming. As the prisoners moved on, the small acts continued. Subtle gestures that cut deeper than any display of military might. Near the tool bench area, a young woman in denim overalls and rolled-up sleeves noticed the German staring at the vending stand behind her. Without hesitation, she grabbed a bottle of Coca-Cola from the crate at her feet, still sweating from the cold, and held it out to one of them. "For you," she said. The POW froze. He had seen Coca-Cola before, back in Europe, but it was a rare, expensive novelty, something only American commanders and black market dealers ever touched. Now, here he was, being offered one freely by a stranger who didn't even know his name. He looked at the guard. The guard nodded. He accepted the bottle with both hands as if handling something sacred. The woman smiled, a simple, unstudied smile, and returned to her machine without waiting for thanks. The prisoners whispered among themselves in German. "Did you see that?" She gave it to him like it was nothing. "They drink this every day?" No. She gave it to him. A kindness not performed out of wealth, but out of instinct. Moments later, the group paused near a massive press the size of a small building, its arm gliding down with hydraulic force to shape wing panels. A black technician wearing a leather apron and safety goggles stepped away from the control panel and gestured toward the machine. "Y'all want to know how this thing works?" he asked, his voice deep and resonant above the hum. The Germans exchanged startled looks. They had assumed he would ignore them, or resent them. Instead, he spoke with the easy friendliness of someone explaining a tractor engine to a neighbor over a fence. He tapped the metal housing proudly. "This here's a hydroform press, takes a flat sheet and bends it into the wing curve. About 15 seconds a cycle. Strong as a bull, gentle as a dance partner, keeps things moving fast." He pantomimed the press motion. The prisoners followed his hands, mesmerized. In Germany, most had never spoken to a black man except through walls of propaganda that painted him as inferior. And yet, this man knew more about aeronautical engineering than many of them had ever learned in school. A POW engineer whispered, "He understands the machine better than any of us." Another said quietly, "He explains it better than my professors." The technician noticed their awe and chuckled softly. "Don't be scared of it. Machines only do what people tell them. Same as war." There was no bitterness in his tone, no resentment, only wisdom, gentle, heavy, unforced. Further down the corridor, a guard handed out hard hats to the prisoners. The helmets were plain, painted gray, but new enough that the straps still smelled like fresh canvas. One POW frowned in confusion. "For us, safety first," the guard said, "even for POWs." Those 3 words rippled through the group like a mild electric shock. Even for POWs. Not because they were valuable, not because America wanted to impress them, but because there were rules, Geneva rules, and the United States followed them. Always. Some of the Germans had seen what happened to Soviet prisoners back home. They had seen hunger, cruelty, indifference. They had watched men treated as less than human. And now, here they were, wearing American safety gear because a nation that owed them nothing still believed they deserved protection. One prisoner, distracted by these thoughts, dropped his glove. Before he could bend down, a middle-aged American worker scooped it up and placed it back in his hand, giving a small, almost fatherly nod. "Don't want to lose that," the worker said. "Cold, I'll bite you harder than any guard." The gesture was so normal, so human, that it shattered something fragile inside the prisoner. He clutched the glove tightly, throat tightening. When the group gathered again near the loading bay, the supervisor reappeared. He studied their faces, pale, stunned, changed. "You boys working anywhere yet?" he asked. A few shook their heads. "Well," he said, "there's plenty to do. We treat you right here. That's how America does things." It was a simple declaration, but it carried a weight deeper than any lecture. Outside the factory, America was shifting too. 8 million women entering the workforce, factories running day and night, rationing at home so soldiers abroad never lacked, and across all those efforts, one rule remained constant. Treat the enemy humanely. Always. POWs in the United States received light work assignments, earned 80 cents a day, bought their own soap and candy, wrote letters home, and were protected by law. For many Germans, it was the first time they had encountered a system where mercy was not a weakness, but a civic expectation. As they moved toward the exit, the prisoners walked slower, not out of exhaustion, but because they were unsure how to carry everything they had felt in the last hour. Kindness was not what they came prepared for, but it was the thing they would remember longest. And far beyond Willow Run, decades later, their children and grandchildren would speak of that day with a tremor in their voices, not of fear or humiliation, but of gratitude for a country that had shown generosity when it had no obligation to do so. For the first time since captivity, the prisoners understood something profound. America's strength was measured not only in steel and machinery, but in the decency of the hands that built them. The moment they returned to the main assembly floor, the atmosphere had changed. The noise was the same, thunderous, relentless, a continuous metallic heartbeat that pulsed through the concrete, but something inside the German prisoners had shifted. Kindness had disarmed them, but what came next would break them. A foreman waved the group toward a raised observation platform overlooking the final assembly line. "You'll want to see this part," he said. "It's where everything comes together." The prisoners followed, boots clunking nervously on the metal steps. From the platform, the entire cathedral of industry unfolded beneath them. It was like standing above a living organism. Pistons breathing, cranes lifting, conveyor tracks snaking like arteries. Thousands of workers moved in perfect synchronization, their actions blending into a rhythm so seamless it looked unreal. At first, the POWs simply watched. Then the breakdown began. A whistle blew at the far end of the hall. The workers shifted, one team stepping aside, another stepping forward. A bomber fuselage glided into place like a ghostly silver spine, and then, without pause, the Americans attacked it with tools and precision. A wing crew snapped 18 bolts into place in under 20 seconds. 2 men holding the panel steady while a third zipped along the seam with an air gun, the rivets firing in rapid succession like a drummer rolling across a snare. Another crew swapped out a hydraulic component in the time it would take someone to button a shirt. A team of female inspectors slid beneath the frame on rolling carts, flashlights sweeping in synchronized arcs. The Germans stared at the clock mounted above the line. A B-24 every 63 minutes. They had heard it earlier. Now they were watching it happen. A prisoner named Vogel leaned forward, gripping the railing. His knuckles whitened. 9. This cannot be, he whispered, but it was. Another fuselage approached. Another wing. Another engine mount. And each time the army of workers engulfed it with such speed and certainty that the Germans felt their throats tighten. One of the POWs, a former Luftwaffe mechanic, murmured in disbelief. Our lines take days to do this. Days. How? He stopped, too overwhelmed to finish. Below them, a team of electricians swarmed a control panel attaching wires in bundles so neat they looked like woven fabric. A black electrician and a white apprentice worked shoulder to shoulder, passing tools back and forth without a word, like a single pair of hands split between 2 bodies. Then came the next shock. An engine test roared to life, deafening and violent, shaking the catwalk under their feet. A radial engine spun, its propeller blurring into a shimmering disk. The Germans flinched, ducking instinctively. The workers didn't. They simply glanced at gauges, scribbled notes, and moved on. The prisoners felt a cold realization settling in their bones. This was not a factory. This was a weapon made of steel, workers, and democracy. One POW swallowed hard. This is a machine that builds machines. A guard overheard him. Exactly, he said. We call it the arsenal of democracy. The phrase struck like a hammer. Arsenal. Democracy. 2 words no propaganda back home had ever put together. For months, the Germans had imagined America as disorganized. Wealthy, yes, but unfocused, soft, incapable of real sacrifice. Yet here was proof of the opposite. A nation united, unstoppable, determined. A nation that didn't need fear or ideology to mobilize. A nation whose power rested in the hands of ordinary people. One prisoner clutched the railing tighter. He glanced down at those hands, calloused, steady, coated in grease, and felt his own confidence fracture. Suddenly, the whistle blew again. The line shifted, and a completed B-24, gleaming like a silver beast, rolled forward on its giant tires. A hush fell over the workers, not out of ceremony, but out of pride. They watched their creation move with the reverence of craftsmen admiring a masterpiece. A few tapped the fuselage as it passed, leaving small fingerprints on the polished metal. One man saluted it. A woman placed her hand on her heart. "It's ready," a supervisor said softly. Ready. That one word shattered whatever illusions remained. A German prisoner named Kruger, once a proud artillery lieutenant, covered his mouth with his trembling hand. "We cannot win," he whispered. "Not against this." Beside him, another man, older, once decorated for bravery on the Eastern Front, felt his knees weaken. This is impossible. But the B-24 kept rolling, unstoppable, inevitable, heading toward the testing runway like a ship sliding into the sea. The guard gestured for the group to follow him outside. They stepped into the icy Michigan air, their breath forming small clouds as they stared toward the runway. The bomber's engines coughed once, twice, then roared to life. Snowflakes fluttered across its wings as the aircraft taxied into position. The Germans instinctively stepped back. The engines boomed, louder than artillery. The ground vibrated beneath their boots. Then the B-24 surged forward, accelerating with impossible power. The prisoners watched as the machine lifted off the runway, rising into the gray winter sky, its 4 propellers slicing the clouds like knives. Every man in the group stopped breathing. The bomber climbed, turned, and banked over the factory. Its shadow swept across the snow and across the prisoners' faces, an enormous cross of metal and might. And in that moment, something inside them finally broke. Not fear, not awe, not humiliation, but certainty. A certainty that Germany, for all its discipline and ideology, could never match this. Not the production, not the unity, not the spirit of a workforce that built bombers with laughter, music, and belief rather than compulsion. A young POW's eyes filled with tears. He wiped them quickly, but not quickly enough. A guard noticed. So did the men standing beside him. No one said a word. The silence that settled over the group was heavy, suffocating, absolute. It was not the silence of obedience or fear. It was the silence of men grappling with the death of an illusion. Inside each mind, the same thought repeated, if America can do this for 1 plane, what can it do for 1,000, 10,000, 100,000? The B-24 shrank in the sky until it became a glittering speck, then vanished into the clouds. The prisoners remained frozen in place long after the sound faded, hands limp at their sides, eyes hollow, spines bowed. The guard glanced at them, men who had once marched with the confidence of a nation that believed itself undefeatable, and saw something he had never seen before. They were defeated without a bullet being fired. When the order came to board the trucks again, the prisoners obeyed silently. No whispers, no side comments, no prideful scoffs. Just silence. The kind of silence that stays with a man his entire life. Behind them, Willow Run continued humming, hammering, assembling. The great American machine unstoppable in its purpose. Workers stepped back into formation, tools buzzing, voices rising. Another fuselage sliding into place as if nothing monumental had happened. But for the men walking back toward the trucks, everything had changed. The war looked different now. America looked different. The future looked different. And as they climbed onto the truck bed, one prisoner turned back for a final glance at the sprawling factory. "We never stood a chance," he whispered. For the first time since the day they were captured, the others did not argue. They simply nodded. Silent, small, forever changed. The ride back to the camp should have been silent. After Willow Run, after the sight of a bomber rising into the gray Michigan sky every 63 minutes, the German prisoners should have retreated into themselves. Shaken, humbled, defeated. But the awakening didn't happen on the truck. It happened after. It began quietly, almost invisibly in the most ordinary places. The lunch yard, the tool benches, the small wooden tables where American workers sat during breaks. It happened not in moments of confrontation, but in moments of humanity so natural, the POWs hardly knew how to defend themselves against it. The day after the tour, a group of prisoners assigned to light labor, sorting scrap metal and sweeping sawdust, were resting near the loading dock. The noon whistle blew, and the Americans poured out of the plant with their lunch pails. The POWs stood off to the side, unsure where to go, unsure if they were allowed to sit. A middle-aged worker with laugh lines around his eyes opened his tin box, revealing slices of cold meat, a thick sandwich, and a bright red apple. He looked over at one of the POWs, Schmidt, a former schoolteacher from Dusseldorf, sitting on the ground with his ration of canned beans. "You want half?" the worker asked. Schmidt froze. No guard had ordered this. No rule required it. The offer came from nothing but instinct. I cannot," Schmidt whispered. "Sure you can," the American said, tearing the sandwich cleanly in two. "There's plenty." He placed the food gently beside Schmidt, then returned to his seat and continued eating as if nothing meaningful had happened at all. The other POWs stared, not at the sandwich, at the ease, at the normalcy, at the total absence of hatred. Later that same afternoon, near the radio repair station, the prisoners heard something drifting across the yard. Music. A jaunty melody, full of brass and swing, pouring from a worker's radio balanced on a windowsill. One prisoner named Keller listened, eyes narrowed. He had grown up in a village where music was heavy, solemn, patriotic. This music was something else entirely. Free, light, unapologetically joyful. Workers laughed as they drank coffee from tin mugs. Someone whistled along. Someone else joked about where they'd go after the war. California, maybe, or Chicago, or anywhere there was sunlight and peace. The Germans listened to the words, to the talk of marriage, children, promotions, vacations, hopes, dreams. One POW shook his head slowly. "They speak of the future as if it belongs to them already." Another replied, "Because it does." For the first time, the prisoners began to understand. The American workers' motivation was not hatred, not ideology, not racial destiny, not national myth. It was family. A man worked because he wanted his son to have shoes next winter, because he wanted his daughter to go to school, because he wanted his wife to have a warm house, because he wanted the war to end sooner, not out of cruelty to the enemy, but simply so life could return to normal. That realization hit the POWs harder than any propaganda lesson they had ever received. "They don't hate us," one whispered. "They don't even think about us." It was not contempt. It was indifference, the purest form of freedom. If the Nazis had taught them that the world ran on domination and fear, Willow Run taught them the opposite. That America ran on personal dreams, individual effort, and the simple belief that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when given dignity and purpose. On the third day after the tour, a group of POWs helped carry wooden crates across the hangar. A supervisor noticed one of the men, young, thin, likely drafted late in the war, struggling with his load. The supervisor stepped forward without hesitation. "Here," he said, "let me get the heavy side." The prisoner stared at him, shocked. In Germany, a supervisor would shout. In America, he helped. A wave of shame crept up the young man's face. "You would help me?" The American shrugged. "Work's easier if everybody pulls." Another prisoner, older, jaded, once a loyal believer in the Reich's superiority, felt something inside him twist. He remembered the factories back home, cold, harsh, driven by fear. He remembered foremen screaming, workers trembling, men disappearing for small mistakes. Here, in America, the prisoners saw none of that. Order without oppression, discipline without cruelty, strength without hatred. It was a revelation. One afternoon, as the prisoners were seated on a bench awaiting their next assignment, a German named Brandt, who had studied economics before the war, watched a group of American women discuss their paychecks, rent, and ration stamps. "They work for their homes," he said softly. "For their children." Another nodded. "Not for the Führer, not for the party, for themselves." Brandt's voice cracked as he added, "We were never allowed that." The others fell silent. Because it was true. Back home, they had worked for a regime that demanded sacrifice, obedience, and purity. Here, Americans worked for life itself. "We are fighting a machine fueled by freedom," one POW finally said, almost reverently. They looked around at the workers laughing, arguing, planning their weekends, singing along to the radio. It wasn't discipline holding the factory together. It wasn't fear. It wasn't ideology. It was choice, the greatest force the Germans had never understood. And as the days passed, world events pressed harder against their consciousness. Rumors reached the camp that the Eastern Front was collapsing, that German divisions were retreating, that cities lay in ruins, that the Allies were preparing something enormous, a landing, a turning point, a storm gathering across the English Channel. "Normandy," one POW whispered at night. "They're going to land in France." Another answered, "And when they do, this country will build 10,000 planes to support it." The truth was undeniable. America was not simply stronger. America was safer. America was humane. The prisoners began to understand something deeper, a quiet, painful truth that settled into their bones like cold. They were the lucky ones. Lucky to be here, in a camp with warm food, safe beds, and guards who treated them like human beings. Lucky not to be fighting on the Eastern Front, where soldiers froze in trenches. Lucky to be captured by a nation that saw prisoners not as animals, but as men. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the Willow Run buildings gold, a POW named Miller sat alone, staring at his hands. Grease under his nails, dirt in the creases. The same hands he once raised in salute. The same hands that had fought for a regime that promised dominance, purity, destiny. Now those hands had helped carry American crates, American tools, American materials, and no one had looked at him with hatred. He whispered into the quiet, "America didn't defeat us through cruelty." His voice trembled as he finished. "It defeated us through abundance." The others heard him, and none disagreed. Their enemy had never been the American worker. Their enemy had been a lie, one that could not survive the sight of a nation where freedom built factories, compassion crossed enemy lines, and ordinary people created miracles because they believed in tomorrow. And in that understanding, something inside them awakened, something moral, something human, something that would stay with them long after the war ended. By the end of the week, the Germans were no longer walking through Willow Run like prisoners. They moved like men who had been allowed to glimpse a different version of the world, one they had never been told existed. A world where work was equalizer, not punishment, where dignity was assumed, not earned, where people built for the sake of their families, not for an ideology. On their final day at the plant, the supervisors gathered the POW group near the exit gate. The noon whistle had just blown, and workers were streaming out of the building for lunch, chatter rising like birdsong in the steel air. It began with a single gesture. A young American riveter, barely 19, freckles across his cheeks, hair dusted with aluminum shavings, approached one of the POWs holding a folded piece of paper. "You guys heading out?" he asked. The prisoner nodded. "Yes, the tour is finished." The riveter gave a shy grin. Mind if I get your autograph? The German blinked, stunned. My autograph? Sure, the kid shrugged. You guys came all the way from Germany. That's something. The POW didn't know whether to laugh or cry. His signature trembled slightly as he scribbled it on the paper. Moments later, 2 more workers approached, then 3. In minutes, the prisoners were surrounded by Americans holding scraps of paper, tool tags, even torn pieces of cardboard. It felt like a baseball field after a game, not a war, like fans crowding their favorite players, eager for a token of the moment. The Germans passed pens, nodded shyly, shook hands they once believed would strike them. One prisoner wiped his palms on his trousers, embarrassed. We're just soldiers, he said. A woman in a denim jumpsuit smiled kindly. So are our boys overseas. Doesn't make you less human. Her words hit him like a blow, not painful, but disarming, like kindness always is after a lifetime of fear. When the crowd thinned, she returned holding something colorful and rectangular. I want you to have this, she said. It was a postcard, bright, bold, beautiful. A woman in a red polka-dot bandana flexed her arm with pride. Rosie, the riveter. The German stared at it, mesmerized. He had seen nothing like it in years. Something cheerful in the middle of war, something that believed in strength without cruelty, purpose without hate. You keep that, she said, a reminder of what we're fighting for. He swallowed hard. Danka, he whispered, voice unsteady. Not far away, a black mechanic approached another small cluster of POWs. His overalls bore oil stains from a morning shift. His hands were large and scarred from years of work. But his eyes, calm, steady, warm, held none of the resentment the Germans expected. You boys did good this week, he said. Helpful, respectful. The prisoners looked down, unsure how to respond. The mechanic leaned on a wooden crate. I know, war makes men do things they didn't choose. But in here, none of that matters. In here, we all sweat the same. The words hung in the air, profound in their simplicity. Then he added, almost philosophically, war ends. Work doesn't. The Germans felt those words settle deep in their chests. Not an accusation, not a lecture, just truth. One POW whispered, That man is wiser than half our officers. Another nodded. He speaks with peace in his voice, like a pastor. The mechanic clapped one prisoner's shoulder before heading back into the plant for the next shift. That single gesture, a friendly pat from a man who had every reason to resent them, left the German blinking back tears he didn't expect. When the guards finally called for the prisoners to line up, something strange happened. 2 Americans, young women who had been sorting cables, waved from across the yard. A group of riveters raised their helmets in farewell. Someone shouted, Good luck, fellas. Someone else added, Stay warm out there. The POWs waved back, awkward, shy, overwhelmed. A connection had formed, not of politics, not of nations, but of people. As they marched toward the gate, an older American worker stepped forward. You take care of yourselves, he said gruffly. This war will end. When it does, remember the folks here. One prisoner, voice cracking, replied, We will. I promise you. We will. The guards loaded them onto the trucks. No one pushed them. No one barked orders. The Americans simply stepped aside, giving them space to came in. As the truck rumbled forward, the prisoners turned back for one final look. Willow Run glowed in the winter sun, its windows shining, its vast walls humming with life, its workers streaming in and out like the steady tide. They saw people laughing, waving, walking arm in arm, They saw men and women of different races working side by side without tension. They saw a nation united in purpose, not by fear or punishment, but by shared hope. One POW exhaled slowly. "We will never see something like this in Germany." Another leaned against the truck wall. "No, this is America." The wind was sharp as it cut across the open road. Snow drifted onto their coats, but none of the prisoners felt cold, not after what they had experienced. For the first time since arriving in the United States, no one spoke about victory. No one clung to pride. No one repeated slogans drilled into them back home. They were too full of awe, of confusion, of gratitude they couldn't yet name. 15 minutes into the drive, as the factory disappeared behind the trees, a quiet voice from the front of the truck finally broke the silence. "America defeated us," he whispered softly, "without firing a gun today." No one contradicted him. No one argued. They simply sat in the gently rocking truck, letting the truth settle. Not one of the prisoners forgot that sentence for the rest of their lives. And decades later, when their children and grandchildren asked about their time in America, they would speak of that day, of kindness, of connection, of Rosie the Riveter, of shared lunch and shared laughter, of equality glimpsed in a factory that built bombers with hope rather than hate. A day when the enemy became human, a day when strangers became neighbors. A day when Willow Run showed them the soul of the United States, not through power, but through people. The war ended, but the memory did not. Long after the guns fell silent, long after the Reich collapsed and Europe staggered from the ashes, the German prisoners who had once walked through Willow Run carried something in their hearts that no victory parade or political speech could erase. They carried the sound of American laughter echoing across the factory floor, the warmth of hands that had shaken theirs, the taste of shared apples and sandwiches, the music of a radio humming with hope. They carried the memory of a nation that had shown them, and the world, what strength truly meant. In the years that followed, many of those POWs returned to Germany and tried to rebuild their lives. But the war had deepened every wrinkle on their faces, and poverty lingered like winter fog. Bombed cities smelled of dust and diesel. Streets were lined with ration lines and rubble. Families were broken. Entire neighborhoods had vanished into smoke. Yet even amid destruction, the POWs who had been to America wrote in their diaries, again and again, the same simple truth. We survived because America showed mercy. The factory changed us more than any sermon. America was powerful because it was kind. These were not sentimental words. They were confessions. Honest, humble, painful confessions for men who had once marched under the swastika, taught to believe in domination, hardness, cruelty. Now they wrote of a different ideology, one born not from conquest, but from decency. One former POW, once a staunch Nazi loyalist, wrote, "At Willow Run, I learned that a free worker builds more faithfully than a frightened one." Another wrote, "If Germany had treated its workers like America treated its prisoners, the war might have ended differently." Time softened the edges of memory, but one memory always stayed sharp. The day they walked through the heart of American industry and discovered that the enemy they feared was not savage, nor decadent, nor chaotic. The enemy was humane, and because of that humanity, America was unshakable. Decades later, when travel restrictions lifted and Europe stabilized, a surprising number of former German POWs made pilgrimages back to America, not as captives, but as friends. Gray-haired men with canes and modest coats stepped off airplanes, carrying small suitcases and fragile memories. They visited the camps where they had slept, the fields where they had worked, and the states that had once held them behind barbed wire they barely remembered anymore. A handful of them traveled to Michigan. They wanted to see Willow Run. But Willow Run was gone. The great factory no longer thundered with engines or glowed with molten metal. Its walls had been dismantled, its machines sold or scrapped, its vast assembly halls vanished into an open stretch of grass and wind. Where a B-24 once rolled off the line every 63 minutes, weeds now swayed gently under the summer sun. The former POWs walked in silence across the field, some using canes, others leaning on their grown children for support. They looked across the emptiness and saw not grass, not silence, but memories, alive, vivid, overwhelming. One man stood with his hat pressed to his chest and whispered, "Here. This is where I understood what America really was." Another bent down, scooping a handful of soil into a small jar. "For my grandchildren," he said, "so they will know the place that saved their grandfather's life." A third man simply closed his eyes and listened, pretending the wind was the hum of machines, the clang of tools, the voices of Americans calling out instructions. He imagined Rosie the Riveter flexing her arm. He imagined the workers waving at him as he left. He imagined the B-24 rising into the sky like a silver promise. His daughter asked quietly, "Is it hard to be here?" He shook his head. "No, it feels like coming home." For Americans listening to these stories today, there is a particular pride, a warm, steady pride that grows in the chest, because these tales are not just about machines or production or wartime necessity. They are about character. The greatest generation did not lose their humanity in war. They strengthened it. When a nation can feed its own and its prisoners, it is strong. When a nation can build bombers and still offer its enemies Coca-Cola, it is noble. When a nation can win a war without losing its soul, it is exceptional. The audience of today feels that pride. They feel that connection. They feel nostalgia for a time when America was united by purpose, not divided by politics. A time when factories were temples of hope and dignity. A time when workers, men and women, black and white, immigrant and native-born, stood side by side for something greater than themselves. Many Americans hearing the story find themselves asking, "Were we really once like this? Could we be like this again?" These are not criticisms. They are heartbreaks wrapped in admiration. Because Willow Run represents something America yearns for, a memory of unity, moral clarity, and shared strength. Then there are the others, the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and family of the German soldiers who once stepped into the factory. Many of them have written letters to museums, posted comments on videos, reached out to historians saying things like, "My grandfather survived because Americans treated him kindly. My great-uncle always said, 'America saved his soul.' My family is here today because an American worker shared his lunch with a prisoner." Their gratitude crosses oceans. It bridges continents. It softens the harshness of history. They thank America not for sparing their ancestors in battle, but for sparing their dignity in captivity. They thank the factory worker who picked up a fallen glove, the foreman who shook hands, the mechanic who said, "War ends, work doesn't," the woman who gifted a postcard of Rosie the Riveter to a frightened young soldier, small acts that echo across generations. The legacy of Willow Run is not just the 8,685 bombers it produced. It is not just the world record of one B-24 every hour. It is not just industrial triumph. Its legacy is moral. It is the story of a nation powerful enough to destroy, but choosing to uplift, a nation strong enough to conquer, but choosing to stay humane, a nation capable of hatred, but choosing mercy instead. And for the German POWs who witnessed it, Willow Run became something holy, a place where their fear dissolved, their pride cracked, their hatred loosened, and their humanity returned. More than one former prisoner later wrote, "That factory did more to change me than any sermon or officer ever did." And history agrees. Because on that winter day in 1944, when 50 German prisoners walked through the heart of American industry, they did not simply see machines or workers or bombers. They saw a nation's character. They saw its soul. And that is why the story ends here. Not with a battle, not with a surrender, not with a victory march, but with a truth carried quietly across lifetimes. The day German POWs toured Willow Run, they didn't just witness American industry, they witnessed America's soul,